A reminder, these talks are recorded. Lea is alone today, so if you have questions, please just unmute yourselves and ask whenever it's appropriate. And just final reminder, next week we have Caroline Liquilung, and she's going to talk about social priors and the information multiplier, the hidden cost of course social information. Lea, without further ado, please start.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone for coming. Yeah, please just unmute yourself because I can't see everybody on the little sidebar. So I'll present Designing Simpler Mechanisms, Transparency and As of Dominance. This is joint work with Roberto Saitto, who joined Kellogg this year. Okay, so the high-level motivation for this project is that for mechanisms that we choose for some practical application to work as intended, it's important that we have some reliable prediction about how people will behave when they're actually interacting with the mechanism. And so this is one of the reasons why dominant strategy mechanisms have traditionally been very popular, because we are able to make a prediction under the assumption of rationality alone, where by rationality, I'm going to mean that agents avoid weakly dominated behaviors. However, unfortunately, by now we have lots of evidence, both from the lab and from the field, that unfortunately, even in dominant strategy mechanisms, the rate at which agents are able to identify and play their dominant strategy can be quite low. And so one of the reasons for which this might be the case is that to verify or find your dominant strategy still requires lots of contingent reasoning, by which I'm going to mean that you need to essentially fix some hypothetical behavior that the other agents might choose and reason through your own behaviors in the mechanism to compare them with each other. And you should do this for every possible hypothetical behaviors the other might choose. And so in response, there's been recent literature on simplicity in mechanism design that has essentially proposed extensive form refinements of dominance that in some sense reduce the need for agents to reason contingently, either about the other agents or about their own future actions. And so while this approach has yielded some mechanisms that seem to work well in practice, refining the class of dominant strategy mechanisms even further can lead us without guidance for many application settings. And so what we want to do in this paper instead is we want to ask whether we can use some of these insights about how to design simpler mechanisms even outside of the class of dominant strategy mechanisms. Okay, so how are we going to do this? I'm going to start by introducing a heuristic for extensive form mechanisms that I call coarse rationality. And so this heuristic helps agent avoid dominated behaviors, but requires much less contingent reasoning than kind of reasoning through the entire mechanism. And so this heuristic is also going to turn out to be much easier to follow as we make a mechanism more transparent, so as we reveal more about other agents' past actions. Okay, and so in principle, this would lead us to want to choose more transparent mechanisms to make this heuristic very easy to adopt, but unfortunately, more transparent mechanisms tend to be incompatible with also maintaining dominant strategy incentives. And so this is an issue because once we no longer have a dominant strategy, it's not obvious that just avoiding playing a dominated behavior is actually enough to best respond to the others from an exposed perspective. Okay, and so to resolve this tension, we're then going to propose a new class of mechanisms, which we call as of dominant strategy mechanisms, that are going to resolve this tension. And then we'll apply this to different application settings to propose some simpler mechanisms. Okay. So just to fix ideas about the kind of question that our framework is going to address, suppose that you're asked to advise an online auction platform, for example, eBay, to design a second price auction for a private value environment. And so the key constraint here is going to be that this auction platform, they potentially want to attract bidders from different time zones who work at different times. And so this auction is going to have to take place asynchronously. So it's going to be open for some pre-specified time period, and then bidders are going to enter whenever it's most convenient for them and submit their bids. Okay. And so the design question that we're going to be interested in today is what we should reveal to a bidder whenever they access the online auction platform. So formally, what information partition should we choose over some specified game tree? So just so that we have some information that we could think about disclosing, let's think about the third bidder, Carl here, who enters after Alice and Bob already submitted their bids. And let's think about what we should tell Carl about these previously submitted bids. Now, one answer given that hopefully most economic theorists would potentially propose is that we could choose a dominant strategy mechanism for this setting by choosing the Vickrey auction. So we can just not reveal anything, essentially make this a sealed bid second price auction, And this is going to ensure that it's going to be a dominant strategy for every bidder to just enter whenever it's most convenient for them and submit their value for the object. Okay. However, unfortunately, we know that second price sealed bid auctions are prone to overbidding. So many people don't recognize that they have a dominant strategy of being truthful here. And so one kind of crude way of addressing this would be to reduce the contingent reasoning kind of mechanically by just revealing everything that we already know about what's happened in this auction so far. So for example, if we tell Carl that 2 bids have already been submitted, one of 70 and one of 100, well, now if his value is below 100, without needing to think about hypotheticals, he definitely doesn't want to submit a bid that is going to make him the winner. It's just going to lead him to make a loss. Okay. However, under this information disclosure policy, the mechanism is no longer going to have a dominant strategy equilibrium. So in general, bidders are now going to want to think about how the bids that they submit affect what others can see and what actions they're going to take in response. Okay. So now, a key observation is that actually in practice, and this is not just true for this online auction example, but in many other settings as well, what we see are actually partial disclosure policies. So in many, many settings, for example, online auction platforms reveal some, but not all the information about what's happened in this auction so far. And so typically they reveal so much information that it's no longer a dominant strategy mechanism, but they kind of don't go all the way to full disclosure. So if this were eBay, what would be revealed is that Alice bid 70 at time T1, and then Bob bid weekly above that at time T2. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of the paper is I'm going to propose a framework to think exactly about how much information we should reveal, even in cases where this information is potentially going to break the dominant strategy incentive compatibility of the mechanism, and what kind of the key forces are that we need to trade off as we're making this decision. Okay. So let me give you a brief preview of the results before I jump into the model. So the key application is going to be this online auction setting that I just kind of briefly alluded to. And what we're going to do is we're going to characterize the maximally transparent as-if dominant strategy asynchronous second price auction, which is going to turn out to rationalize formats that we observe frequently in practice. For example, this is used by eBay, but also many other online platforms. Secondly, we're going to apply our framework also to some other application settings, in particular multi-unit auctions and matching problems, which are settings in which kind of dominant strategy, incentive compatibility, and transparency are kind of particularly incompatible with each other. And so we're going to be able to identify some more transparent but as-if dominant strategy mechanisms in these settings, and we're going to argue that these might outperform their less transparent dominant strategy counterparts, which is going to explain a range of experimental evidence that has shown this previously. And finally, if I have the time, I'll talk about a learning foundation of this coarse rationality heuristic that we propose and its relationship to weak dominance solvability. Okay, great. So unless there's any question, let me very briefly talk about the related literature. So kind of the in spirit, we're really most related to the recent literature on simplicity and extensive form mechanism design. And unlike some of the key papers in this literature, the difference with this paper is going to be that we're going to use the extensive form to relax rather than to refine the dominant strategy property. And kind of the motivation for doing this is a range of experimental evidence that already exists that has shown that more transparent mechanisms generally perform better. And this can be true not only fixing a particular solution concept, but even as we kind of break, for example, dominant strategy incentive compatibility. And finally, our main application is going to relate us to a literature on online auctions. The key difference is going to be that we're going to focus on the design of the information disclosure policy in one single auction. And we're going to think about kind of the benefits in terms of contingent reasoning rather than some of the other benefits that people have thought about that are mostly regarding kind of information aggregation in settings where there's maybe a common value component. Okay. So let's jump into the model. So I'll be thinking about private value environments for today. So I'm going to index agents by n, and each agent is going to have a private type that's denoted by theta n, which is going to define her preference order over some set of feasible social outcomes that are denoted by omega. And then throughout, I'm going to distinguish kind of two different aspects of a mechanism. The first one is the game tree, which I'll denote by x. And the second one is the information partition, which I'm also going to sometimes refer to as the information disclosure policy over that game tree. And I'll denote that by calligraphic I. And then in these mechanisms, agents are going to have access to behaviors that I'll denote by sigma n, which just map the histories at which an agent moves into the actions. And then a strategy is going to map each agent's type into some behavior in the mechanism. Okay. And then the two kind of benchmarks that I'll be talking about in the first part of the talk are the concepts of an undominated strategy and a weakly dominant strategy. And so a strategy is undominated if there's no type for whom some alternative behavior, sigma n, performs weakly better than what's specified by the strategy against all possible behaviors of the others and strictly against some. And a strategy is a dominant strategy or a weakly dominant strategy if it's a best response for each, if it specifies a best response for each type against every possible behavior of the others. Okay. So let me introduce our coarse rationality heuristic, and I'm going to start by kind of giving a little bit of motivation for why and how we came up with this heuristic. Okay, so the idea is that in practice, the mechanisms that agents interact with, for example, an online auction or a school choice mechanism, are typically described in terms of their move-by-move rules. Okay, so you kind of know when you're going to be asked to make a decision and what actions are going to be available to you and how this is going to affect kind of the game tree going forward. And so then, in principle, checking whether some behavior that you have available is dominated by another requires you to do two different things. The first one is that you need to understand the full set of behavior that is available to the others. Okay, and so this can be especially in mechanisms that reveal a lot of information so that others can condition their behavior on that information going forward. This set of behaviors might be very, very large. Okay, and then secondly, what you should do is you should condition on each one of those behaviors that you deduced and compare your possible alternative strategies with each other in order to determine whether any of them are dominated or not. Okay, and so both of these tasks can require lots of contingent reasoning, lots of reasoning about hypotheticals. And so a natural question is whether there's some sort of heuristic that reduces the burden in terms of the contingent reasoning that agents need to engage in. And it turns out that the answer is yes, and that the answer is that instead of deducing the full set of behaviors available to the others, agents can actually focus on a much smaller set of behaviors in order to ensure that they're playing something that's undominated. Okay. And so this smaller set of behaviors for the others are going to be what we refer to as coarse behaviors. Okay, so formally, given some mechanism with a tree X and an information partition calligraphic I, a behavior is going to be coarse if it's measurable with respect to the coarsest information partition that satisfies perfect recall that we can define on this game tree X. Okay, so let me just make this kind of clear with this example of this online auction. The kind of coarsest information partition, so the least informative information partition we can choose for the online auction is the one corresponding to Vickery's auction, so where we don't disclose anything about what the others have done in the past. Now, if this were the information partition of the mechanism, then the only behaviors that are available to everybody are the behaviors that are the only strategies that are available essentially map a type into some set of bidding dates and the bids that you submit at those dates. You can't condition on anything else because you're not informed about anything else. Okay. However, of course, in principle, as we make the mechanism more transparent, so we reveal some information about the previous bids or how many bidders are in this auction, this actually does give agents information to condition their behaviors on. Okay. However, those behaviors are not going to be coarse. And they're not going to be coarse in the sense that they kind of condition finally, quote unquote, on the information that is disclosed throughout the mechanism. And so notice that the set of coarse behaviors for a mechanism, since it just depends on the coarsest information partition for the tree, is not going to vary as we change the transparency of the actual information disclosure policy. Okay. So coarse behaviors are, in some sense, kind of a natural set of behaviors to focus on, because exactly of what I just said, they don't condition on the information that others might observe as they go through the mechanism. And so in some sense, constructing them doesn't require you to think about kind of the hypothetical information that others hypothetically might condition their behavior on. Okay, and so these behaviors are kind of always available without you having to think about the information that might be revealed. And so in some sense, they're kind of a particularly focal set. Now, moreover, and crucially, these coarse behaviors are also enough to explain all the play that you might observe throughout the mechanism. Okay, so wherever I call you to play in the mechanism, whatever history we have reached, it's always going to be consistent with some strategy profile that consists only of coarse behaviors, because you're never going to observe the counterfactual, right? So you can always imagine that the others would have submitted the exact same bids in this auction, even if they had seen some information. Okay, and so in that sense, you can maintain this belief that others might just be behaving coarsely throughout the mechanism without ever kind of being forced to wake up that you're missing some contingent behaviors here.
Can
Okay.
I think of a course behavior as something that doesn't require me to pay attention?
Yeah, so that's another way of thinking about it. Like you literally don't need to even kind of look at the information that the auction platform provides you. You're just gonna behave without looking even at this information, just ignoring it in some sense. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, great. So now, why are course behaviors? I mean, I think they're kind of a focal set of behaviors to consider as you're trying to determine how to behave, but it turns out they're also a useful set to consider as you're determining how to behave. Okay, so let's consider the set of behaviors that are a best response against all the coarse behaviors of the other agents. Okay, so you just consider the smaller set of behaviors available to the others, the coarse ones, and you're going to best respond to that. So those are the behaviors in the set calligraphic CN. Now, these coarsely optimal behaviors, I do want to note, may not exist. In particular, they require you to have a dominant strategy under the coarsest information partition that we can define on the game tree. And this is perhaps a bit more subtle, they need not themselves be coarse. Okay, so this is the set of behaviors that is optimal for you if you think the others are not going to condition their behavior on the information that's disclosed. But what's optimal for you today might depend on the information that you have today. That information is not hypothetical. We are allowing you to actually condition your behavior on that. Okay, and so that might make a coarsely optimal behavior not itself coarse.
So like the second point is related to the perfect recall assumption, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Okay.
So Lea, just you're going quite fast here with these notions. So what Andrew said is useful. Another thing here is you are coarsely optimal if you assume that everybody else is coarse, but not necessarily yourself. You are behaving optimally given the information you have. Is that
Yes,
Do I
exactly.
understand
So
correctly? Yes.
yes,
Okay.
so you understand correctly. And so this exactly means that, potentially the behavior that I would choose if I behave coarsely optimally is kind of not consistent with the other's conjecture about how I behave, right? Because it might actually not be a coarse behavior. I might want to use the information that I have available. And that's exactly what we're going to get back to in just a second. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Could I ask, so I want to think about like deferred acceptance,
Mhm.
mail proposing deferred acceptance, and something with very coarse information might be matching through a smartphone app.
Mm,
I've got a phone and I pick somebody to propose to, but nobody else observes my proposals. And
mhm.
something with a lot of information might be a ballroom where there's
Yes.
physical proposals to go approach somebody. So would this be kind of like I don't believe anybody else is paying attention to what I do, even though they're free to and I'm also free to?
Yes, exactly. So if you want to, for now, let's say, the way I've interpreted is that even if you're in the ballroom, kind of you're occupied with trying to determine who you want to match with. And so you're kind of ignoring, who everybody else is talking to, in which order, and you're not going to condition your future behavior on that. What I'm going to show you in a second is that actually, if all of us are doing this, then this is going to be kind of a meta equilibrium, even if we are not behaving coarsely. Okay, and so in that sense, it's not even going to require that we kind of hold this belief very firmly. It's also just an equilibrium. Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so here's kind of the first result, which is going to be crucial kind of going forward, which is that a coarsely optimal strategy, so a strategy that best responds just to this small set of coarse behaviors of the others, that is going to stay kind of, this set of course behaviors for the others is going to stay the same in size, even as I vary the information partition, right? But just focusing on this small set of course behaviors for the others is always going to ensure that I choose an undominated strategy. Okay, and so in that sense, it gives me kind of a much less costly way of determining a set of behaviors that is guaranteed to be undominated. I don't need to think about the full set of behaviors available to the others under the real information partition. I can just focus on the course behaviors, which are the ones available under the coarsest information partition possible. Okay, and so this means that especially in a dominant strategy mechanism where me choosing an undominated behavior means I choose my weakly dominant strategy, this is a very compelling heuristic, right? We can all just think of this smaller set of behaviors. Let's not worry too much about the contingent behaviors. We can just use a much simpler understanding of what the others can do. And it's going to ensure that we're always, nevertheless, gonna best respond even from an exposed perspective. Okay. But so this is not going to be true outside of the class of dominant strategy mechanism, exactly because what I said to Francesco, right? So as Francesco said, you behaving coarsely optimally does not mean that you behave coarsely necessarily. And so that means that if we're not in a dominant strategy mechanism, perhaps now I'm not best responding to you from an exposed perspective if I ignore the fact that you might want to choose a non-coarse strategy. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to ensure in an as-if dominant strategy mechanism that behaving coarsely optimally is essentially a meta-equilibrium. So that then, again, even from an exposed perspective, we're not going to be able to do better than to all choose our coarsely optimal strategies. Okay, so this is exactly how we define the as-if dominant strategy mechanisms. A mechanism is going to be as-if dominant strategy if it satisfies two conditions. The first one is that kind of this coarse rationality heuristic needs to make a prescription. So each agent better have at least one coarsely optimal strategy. And secondly, and this is going to ensure this exposed best response, every coarsely optimal strategy profile, so every strategy profile consisting of these coarsely optimal strategies, is an exposed equilibrium. So it's a Nash equilibrium for every type profile and for every chance behavior. Okay, and so in this sense, this is exactly the class of mechanisms in which coarse rationality is a self-supporting heuristic. If everybody behaves coarsely rationally, I'm not going to have an incentive, even from an exposed perspective, to consider the additional behaviors that are actually available under the finer information disclosure policy that the mechanism might have. Okay, now in kind of equivalent characterization, and this is kind of, I call this kind of a robustness, is that this is the set of strategy profiles. This is ensuring that the set of strategy profiles that is robust to all the ways in which the opponents could deviate in a coarse way is a product set of exposed equilibria. Okay, so notice that the second condition in the definition says that every coarsely optimal strategy profile has to be an exposed equilibrium, which means that kind of no matter which coarsely optimal strategy I pick for you, and no matter which I pick for me, it needs to be an exposed equilibrium. In particular, there is a set of exposed equilibria that is a product set, and that is such that each strategy that might be part of one of these exposed equilibria is a best response, at least against the coarse behaviors of the others, but also against the non-coarse, coarsely optimal behaviors of the others. Okay, so in that sense, you can think of this as like a particularly robust set, product set of exposed equilibria in these mechanisms. Okay, I'm gonna just pause for 1 second on this because it has a lot of moving parts.
Example, please.
Yes, I'll do example in just one on the next slide. Yeah.
Am I right that an implication of this is if you coarsen the information as much as possible, this would be dominant strategy?
Exactly. That's exactly right.
You're weakening dominant strategy implementability, but still in the context of strategy proof rules. We're not getting new objectives we can
That's exactly right. So we're still restricted to strategy proof implementable social choice rules. Really what we're thinking about is kind of the set of extensive form mechanisms that we can use in order to implement those. Yeah, that's exactly right. So actually, one slide before the example. I'm sorry, Francesco. One more slide before the example, just some accounting, which is just, kind of as Andy just noticed. So every dominant strategy mechanism is going to be as if dominant. Okay. And so in particular, the outcomes are going to coincide. And moreover, every as if dominant strategy profile is going to be an undominated exposed equilibrium. Yes, every as if dominant strategy profile is an undominated exposed equilibrium. So that it's an exposed equilibrium follows from kind of just the second condition in the definition. That it's undominated follows from this first theorem that I showed you that coarsely optimal behaviors are undominated. Okay, and so in a sense, coarse rationality is like a useful heuristic because it allows you to simplify this task of deducing the full behavior space of the others. However, you potentially might have to condition on the others' behaviors still in order to identify your as if dominant strategies. So on the coarse behaviors. In particular, in a static mechanism, it's going to coincide with determining your dominant strategy, and we know that that's in general hard. Okay. Great. Okay. So let me talk about transparency, and let me go back to the example from the introduction. Okay, so we're going to say that a mechanism is more transparent than another if they share the same game tree, and one has a finer information partition than the other, a strictly finer information partition, which just means that whenever you're called to play, you know weekly more about what's going on. Okay, and so this is gonna tie us back to the example from the introduction. So we have this no disclosure dominant strategy auction, the Vickrey auction, which is going to be kind of the least transparent mechanism on this game tree. Right, and then we had these potentially many partial disclosure information policies, including the one used by eBay, which are going to be more transparent than the one corresponding to Vickrey, according to this definition. And I'm going to show you that these are all as if dominant strategy, that these information disclosure policies all yield as if dominant strategy mechanisms. Okay, so notice that they break dominance because this already gives agents potentially lots of information to condition on. I could just decide that if there is a competitor, I'm just always going to bid 1,000,000, which is going to lead Alice to like not want to enter until the very last second in the auction, right? So it's not a dominant strategy mechanism anymore. However, it's still going to be an as if dominant strategy mechanism, and I'm going to go through the exact reasoning for why that's the case once I go back to this application setting.
May I ask one question about the definition of equilibrium?
Yes.
Why do you require the second condition? Why
Yes.
do you require the strategy profile to be exposed to equilibrium rather than interim? Because you make a decision at the interim stage. So I thought the interim optimality would be more natural.
Yes. So kind of a twofold answer. So we are kind of already restricting ourselves to strategy proof implementable choice rules with the first requirement. So exposed incentive compatibility seemed kind of consistent with the idea that we don't want to think about kind of beliefs and how your beliefs enter your choice about what to do. Because indeed, kind of once you think about, for example, Bayesian implementation, you're going to have to take a stance also on how the information that you see is going to affect how you form beliefs and whether information actually makes it more complicated for you potentially to form your beliefs. And so we wanted to abstract away from all of that and just think about settings where you really don't need to use your belief about your opponent's type in order to determine your best response. Now, kind of an alternative way.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I think you will have a problem with existence, I guess. Does it exist all the time?
So this exists as long as the strategy, as long as the social choice rule that we're implementing is strategy proof implementable. Because then under the least transparent information disclosure policy, it is going to be a dominant strategy mechanism. And then essentially the question is just how much can you reveal while maintaining that as if dominance property?
And my second question is heuristics is a restriction on the rationality or consequence of minimizing information processing cost. So I'm
Yes.
asking question about the restriction or sequence.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think that's a very good point. So we thought about it mainly as a heuristic. So as people literally cannot potentially engage in all this contingent reasoning. However, you are absolutely correct that, once we have an as if dominant strategy mechanism, and we actually had this micro foundation in a previous version of the paper, you can show that if we have some kind of information processing costs, so kind of thinking about larger behavior spaces for the others as we're determining our best response, ensures that in an as if dominant strategy mechanism, it's a strict exposed equilibrium for all of us to just think about the kind of smallest set of behaviors for the others, in the sense that we just think about the coarse behaviors of the others. So there is a micro foundation that exactly relies on kind of this literal kind of computational cost of just thinking about larger behavior spaces. Yeah. And we're going to see at the end that actually, you can also give kind of a learning foundation for this heuristic as well. And then you can kind of pick in your setting what you think is kind of the most reasonable way for this to emerge. Yeah. Okay. So let me go back to transparency. And let me tell you why, having this access to this class of as if dominant strategy mechanisms, which is a superset of the dominant strategy ones, is useful exactly because it allows us to choose more transparent mechanisms. Okay. So in order to understand kind of the benefits and drawbacks of transparency, I'm going to work mostly with the example, and then I'm going to formalize the costs and benefits on the next 2 slides. But for now, I'm just going to work with this auction here. Okay, and so I want to first kind of reiterate a point that I already made briefly in the introduction, which is that increasing transparency in general is going to help agents behave coarsely rationally. Okay, so whenever an agent moves in this auction, if they just want to behave coarsely optimally, well, as we increase transparency, the set of behaviors that they are thinking about for the others is not going to change. Okay, that's fixed. And so what can change? Well, what can change is kind of the actual hard information that they have about what's happened so far. So for example, we might tell Carl, listen, the final price is going to be above 70 because we already have 2 bids above 70. And so if Carl was planning to overbid above his value, then this is now going to place him into the contingency where overbidding is never profitable. Okay, and in particular, he can now see that overbidding is never profitable without having to think about hypotheticals, just thinking about the contingency that we placed him in specifically. Okay. However, this benefit of transparency kind of relied on me saying that Carl is not going to think about the additional behaviors that are generated with this information that is being revealed. Okay, and so in particular, in general, as we disclose any information in this auction, we're going to break the dominant strategy property, which means that potentially we are giving agents an incentive to think about these contingent behaviors, these non-coarse behaviors. Okay, so for example, again, as I mentioned on the previous slide, Bob might just believe that Carl is kind of a crazy type who always bids aggressively if he observes some competition. Well, then it's going to be in Bob's best interest to kind of wait as long as possible, even if that was not his most preferred date of entering this auction, to kind of wait as late as possible so that this information is never going to get disclosed to Carl. Okay. And so in particular, Bob's response is going to depend on his beliefs. He might also believe that Carl gets scared when there's competition, in which case he's going to want to bid very early. And so what he wants to do is really going to depend exactly on the beliefs he holds about Carl's behavior. Okay, and so this benefit and these benefits and these costs of transparency are, not just true like this for the auction, but actually kind of the 2 arguments I just made to you are going to generalize to kind of virtually any mechanism that we can think about in this framework. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to introduce the notion of obvious dominance and obviously dominated actions. Okay, and so a strategy is going to be obviously dominant, and so this is a concept introduced by Zhang in 2017, if at every history where an agent may move under his dominant strategy, all of the deviating actions, which I'll denote by A, are obviously dominated for that type. Okay, and so what that means is that the best possible outcome after deviating is no better than the worst possible outcome that can follow if you continue to follow your dominant strategy. And so crucially, as we're doing this kind of max-min comparison, we are not fixing a particular behavior profile for the other agents. Okay, so a key example of an obviously dominant mechanism is an ascending clock auction, okay, where suppose the price is below your value. If you drop out, which is a deviation, the best possible thing that can happen is that you get 0 because you dropped out. Whereas, of course, if you follow your dominant strategy, the worst possible thing that can happen is, again, that you don't get the item because others outbid you. And so this inequality is going to be satisfied. Yep. And so what I'm going to show you in a second is that essentially more transparency is going to increase obviously dominated deviating actions. Okay, so this is kind of the formal definition, just summarizing the benefits of transparency. If a mechanism is more transparent than another, then two things are going to be true. First of all, the coarsely optimal strategies in the less transparent mechanism are going to remain coarsely optimal in the more transparent mechanism. So we're kind of not getting rid of the good behaviors that you were thinking of. And secondly, we're going to make them easier to spot. Okay, so in particular, for every coarsely optimal strategy, verifying course optimality is going to require you conditioning on fewer contingencies, by which we mean kind of deviation and opponent behavior pairs. And secondly, the set of deviations that are obviously dominated is going to be weakly larger as we increase the transparency of the mechanism.
Is the first result to continue to hold when you replace exposed by interim?
So
I
the
think
first
this is the
result is
place
going to
where you
continue.
need the exposed.
Yes, so all of this is gonna rely on the exposed incentive compatibility. So we're not taking any stance about how beliefs are getting updated and how the equilibria are going to change. Yeah. Okay. And so essentially what this result says is that whether you're kind of within a particular set of mechanisms or within a particular solution concept, or you're crossing it from dominance to exposed incentive compatibility, kind of definitely verifying the course optimality of a strategy becomes easier the more transparent the mechanism is. And so this has been shown by a bunch of experiments that kind of more transparent versions of, for example, dominant strategy mechanisms can outperform the less transparent counterparts.
I want to ask about, since you just raised obvious strategy proofness, this definition doesn't involve any kind of sequential rationality or rationality throughout the game. Have you considered a variant in that direction?
So it does in the sense that you are incorporating the information that you observe, right? So this is what's making your set of coarsely optimal behaviors expand, is that kind of as you have more information about kind of the part of the game tree that we're in, you might actually now be indifferent between more of your behaviors. So in that sense, you are kind of making use a little bit of the information, but you're right that so later on we'll consider a version of this that imposes perfection, which is gonna be kind of the closest to that. Yeah. Okay.
I also have a question. So for the ascending clock auction, I think it still reviews perfectly on every information. So what goes wrong with that? But it's still like obvious dominance.
Yes.
Kind of like what you want.
Yes. Let me get back to you on the next slide. Yes. Perfect. Okay. So these are kind of the benefits of transparency. And so let's think about the cost of transparency, which is this fact that as you increase transparency, you increase the set of behaviors. And so in general, this means that potentially your strategy is not going to be optimal against every possible behavior of the others anymore, because they just have more of them, right? Okay, and so let's take any dominant strategy equilibrium of some mechanism. And we're going to have two results. One is an intensive margin result. So this tells you kind of how much information you can reveal within a particular game tree. And the other one is going to be an extensive margin result, which goes back to the clock auction question. Okay, so on the intensive margin, what happens? Well, if you want a strategy to remain dominant as you make the information partition finer, so you disclose more information, essentially what you need is that the two histories that you are separating at which some other agent is going to move need to satisfy a sort of local obvious dominance condition. Okay, so now this is kind of a lot of notation to read. So really what I want you to think of is the following. What I want you to think of is that whenever you're revealing information, you are allowing the other agents to condition on that information in the most adversarial way possible, right? They could just decide if you bid truthfully, they're going to bid 1,000,000, and if you don't bid truthfully, they're going to drop out. Okay? And so essentially what this means is that for this information to be safe to reveal, we need to have had that obvious dominance, min-max inequality that I showed you on the previous slide on that little subpart of the game tree where you have now created more information. Okay? Again, this is really just hedging against kind of others conditioning in adversarial ways. Okay? And so in general, this is going to be very hard to do. So in a second prize sealed bid auction, I can't reveal anything to you about what the others have bid. If you're kind of the last bidder on the tree, I can't reveal anything to you about what the others have done without breaking the dominance of the auction. Okay. However, there are some trees along which you can actually reveal all the information. Okay, so, and this is going to be the case if that tree had an obviously dominant strategy under perfect information. Okay, so unless our dominant strategy profile S is actually obviously dominant in the perfect information version, so where all the information is disclosed, there will always be some point at which we're breaking the dominance of that strategy profile, and we're going to end up with an exposed equilibrium. Okay, and so this goes back to a result that Andy actually proved, which is that in a mechanism of perfect information, a strategy profile is going to be a dominant strategy equilibrium if and only if it's an obviously dominant strategy equilibrium.
Lea, I'm trying to, while you're talking, I'm trying to map what these things are with the example. And
Yes.
I realized that perhaps I should have asked this before, but in the example, you're allowed to choose when you bid,
Yes.
right? Are you allowed to bid more than once in reply to other people?
Yes, yes. I'm gonna formalize the example and we're gonna talk about all of these things. Yes. Okay.
Okay.
But so this second extensive margin result goes to Linchen's question, which is that if you have an obviously strategy proof mechanism, you know, that one you can have perfect information, you can reveal everything. So there's no trade-off for that particular tree and that particular strategy profile. Okay. However, in general, there will be a trade-off because for many things, we can't find an obviously strategy-proof implementation at all. And so for those settings in which we have a trade-off between increasing transparency and maintaining dominance, we propose that maybe maintaining as-if dominance is potentially a better goal because it allows us to get some of the benefits of the more transparent mechanisms. Okay? And so coarsely optimal strategies are going to get easier to verify. Moreover, transparency also has kind of lots of benefits that are orthogonal to simplicity that have been discussed in the literature. So for example, they can improve verifiability, credibility, and all these kind of goals as well. Okay. However, crucially, and again, I'm gonna formalize this online auction setting in just a second, and we're gonna see this very precisely. As if dominant strategies, mechanisms are going to provide a bound on how much transparency you can provide. Okay, and so ex post incentive compatibility cannot do that. Because of course, once you conjectured kind of an equilibrium strategy profile, it doesn't matter what the information partition is, it's going to remain in equilibrium. This is not going to be true for as-if dominance because we require this product set structure of the exposed equilibrium. Okay, so as I promised, now let's go back to this online auction setting and let's formalize it. And I'm gonna get back to Francesca's questions as I do so. Okay. So let's apply as-if dominance to this online auction setting where we have a single unit to be allocated among a set of agents where each agent has some type that is going to consist of two different components. So the first component is the standard one, which is a private value for the object. And then agents are just going to get a quasi-linear payoff from the allocation xn and the payment pn. Okay, secondly, we're going to assume that agents have some preference ordering over a finite set of feasible participation dates. Okay, so there are kind of some sets of dates at which agents can enter, and they just have some sort of preference about kind of when and how many times they want to access this online auction. And we're going to assume that the preferences over outcomes are separable in payoffs and participation dates. We need something a little bit weaker than that, but just this is the simplest version to think about. Okay. And so the online auction platform wants to design a highly transparent as-if-dominant strategy second price auction to either implement the efficient allocation or perhaps to maximize revenues. And they want to enable asynchronous bidding to accommodate preferences over these participation dates. And so in particular, the way that this, let me see if this works. The way that this auction is going to work is that at the start, a reserve price is going to be chosen, and then agents can bid at these dates within this set T. And so each agent can access multiple times. And we're going to assume that as agents enter kind of a second or third or fourth time, they can revise their bids upwards. Okay, so quick note here about this upward revision. This is actually the interesting case, because if you can revise your bid downwards, it's a little bit unclear what it even means to reveal that somebody has already bid 100, if they can take that bid away again. Okay, and so we're going to assume that agents can only revise their bid upwards so that we have some information that we can credibly disclose that is not going to kind of disappear again. Okay, and then kind of at the last date, which is max T, the item is going to be sold to the highest bidder at a price equal to the second highest submitted bid or to the reserve, whichever is higher. Okay, so this is going to be the game tree that we're thinking about. Francesco, if there was something that I missed about the description of the auction, let me know, but I think that's okay. Perfect. Okay. So now this is only describing the game tree X, okay? It's not yet describing the information disclosure policy over this game tree, okay? And so this is exactly what we're going to be interested in. So just as a reminder, we have this kind of no disclosure dominant strategy auction, the Vickrey auction. We could go full disclosure and disclose literally everything that's happening as it is happening live. This is still going to be an ex post incentive compatible mechanism where being truthful is an ex post equilibrium. However, of course, there's kind of infinitely many partial disclosure policies that we could choose in between, okay? And so a particular one that we define formally in the paper, and I'm going to define it in words here, is what we refer to as the online English auction. And so the online English auction is going to disclose the reserve price and all of the information about the previous bids, except the value of the current highest bid. Okay, so what you are going to know about the highest bid is when it was submitted and by whom, and you're going to know it's above the second highest bid or above the reserve, but you're not going to know exactly how high it is. Okay, that's the key. Okay, so now why is this online auction online English auction interesting to us? Well, this turns out to be the format that's used very commonly in practice. Okay, it's used by eBay, AuctionNet, by the US General Services Administration, and many other online auction platforms. Okay. Now, crucially, this is going to be an as-if dominant strategy mechanism, but notice that this is already no longer a dominant strategy mechanism. Okay, so agents can condition their behavior on what they know about, for example, the second highest or third highest bid, and so that's going to break the dominant strategy property of this auction. Okay, but what we show is that actually what this format does is it maximizes transparency among a different set, which is the as-if dominant strategy, asynchronous second price auctions. Okay, so it achieves maximal transparency within this class of as-if dominant strategy, asynchronous second price auctions. Okay, and so this kind of gives a reason for why this format might be so common in practice. It does maximize transparency subject to some constraint, even though, you know, we have a dominant strategy mechanism available here that they chose to not use for their online auctions. Okay. So let me talk about the proof and explain why this is true. Okay, and so I want to do this for two reasons. First of all, because, you know, this is kind of one of the key results. And second of all, because actually the proof is going to characterize all the information disclosure policies that are going to yield an as-if dominant strategy mechanism. Okay, so an asynchronous second price auction is going to be as-if dominant strategy if and only if the information partition satisfies the following condition. Until it is certain that the final price will be at least beta, no agent is going to observe whether somebody else's bid is at least beta. Okay, so what does this mean? Let's go back to this auction with Alice, Bob, and Carl. By the time Carl enters, what do we know about the final price? Well, we know it's going to be at least 70. That's what it would be if we ended the auction today, right? And so what would not be as of dominant is to reveal something above this cutoff of 70. So for example, it would not be as of dominant to reveal that Bob actually bid above 90. And intuitively, why is this not going to be as of dominant? Well, what it's going to do is it's going to make Carl potentially indifferent between punishing Bob and bidding 89 or just not submitting a bid at all. But which one of these he chooses, and these are both coarsely optimal for Carl, which one of these he chooses is going to matter for whether or not Bob's behavior was indeed a best response to Carl. Okay, and so we no longer have this product set of exposed equilibria that is a best response to all the coarse deviations of the other agents. Now, in contrast, revealing kind of less information than what eBay does is always going to be as of dominant. So for example, just saying that 2 people already bid above 40. Because this is exactly going to maintain the incentive for Carl to bid his value and exactly his value if it is above that.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
So you have 3 agents here, and we're looking at Alice and Bob. So basically, Bob is the one whose bid we don't know about. Carl is the one that we're interested in thinking about. And Alice is the one that provides the anchor. But suppose that you add another anchor. So you add below that. It seems to me, but something you said before, that would be the same. So you would still reveal that the bid is above 7. So really what you're saying is what's crucial here is that you reveal the second highest bid.
Exactly. You cannot reveal me any information above the second highest bid. That's the crucial bit. What you reveal below that, we don't care about. Yeah.
Okay.
That's exactly right. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So let me very briefly talk about some other application settings. And this is going to be kind of very concise in the interest of time. So in particular, we also apply our framework to multi-unit auction settings and to matching settings. Now, these are 2 settings where essentially you can only do very, very, very restrictive information disclosure policies if you want to maintain the dominant strategy property. And that's why as of dominance might be interesting to look at. Okay, so in particular, there are 2 versions of an ascending auction known as the audible auction that can implement the efficient allocation or the victory outcome in a multi-unit setting. Okay, so these are literally multi-unit analogs of ascending clock auctions. And you can make those auctions dominant strategy by kind of not disclosing when other people drop out of these auctions for particular units. Or you can use kind of an exposed incentive compatible version of this auction where you can observe when other people are dropping units from their demand. Okay, and kind of in similar spirit, in matching settings, you can consider versions of matching mechanisms that are static versus those where kind of we actively take part in the mechanism and I know where I got rejected before I have to make my next application. So what we show is that kind of in all these settings, the more transparent versions, which are the ones that reveal more information, are still as of dominant strategy mechanisms. And so this would yield us to predict that perhaps they can actually outperform their dominant strategy counterparts because they maintain the heuristic of coarse rationality. So there's still kind of a straightforward set of best responses. And moreover, we're not giving any agent who understands that there's more behaviors now any incentive to deviate if he thinks the others are just playing coarsely optimally. Okay, and so this is exactly what all these experiments had found in the past. So just to kind of say what is shown here on this graph. So these graphs are showing the data from experiments that are comparing dominant strategy mechanisms with kind of more transparent versions of those mechanisms. And so what happens from the blue bars, which are depressingly low, those are the dominant strategy. This is the rate of truthfulness for the dominant strategy mechanism. to the orange bars, which are the only exposed incentive compatible mechanisms, is that information was disclosed that actually broke the dominant strategy property of these mechanisms. And so from a theoretical perspective, it should be a bit puzzling why people are truthful more often after I took away the dominant strategy property of the truthful strategy, right? However, all of them find consistently that actually those more transparent mechanisms outperform the dominant strategy counterparts. And we argue that's because actually now some of the deviations are obviously dominated. So some of the deviations now are much easier to see as dominated. And moreover, you are actually maintaining incentives in kind of a good way by making course rationality a meta-equilibrium of these mechanisms. Okay. So I'm going to pause 1 second. I went over this very quickly.
Do you have a result that the Ausubel auction provide? So your result says Ausubel auction provide the maximal transparency. Do you have a result that Ausubel auction provides the courses information to achieve that goal? I'm asking about necessity of Ausubel auction. You show sufficiency of Ausubel auction, but do you have a necessity of Ausubel auction? I think that's really interesting result.
Yes, so the information partition that is chosen in these experiments, in all these experiments actually, is not necessarily the most transparent that you can have under the as-if dominance constraint. Indeed, these experiments were all run before we kind of wrote the paper. And so all of them kind of conjectured a level of transparency that seemed safe to them, and we give a reason for why. But what I think would be interesting would be to say, okay, but here's kind of as transparent as you can go according to our framework, and to then see whether that's the right bound. But we actually don't know right now what would happen under that bound.
But presumably you know how close you are
Yes.
for each of these experiments to what would be the one that you would have used if you had written the paper before the experiments, right?
Yes.
Presumably you know if they are a little bit too much or a little bit too little.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So the Ausubel is pretty close. Like there's almost nothing you could reveal. In addition, the TTC is still pretty far.
Can I just follow up on that? With the fixed social choice rule that Ausubel implements, you are fixing the game tree in comparing coarsening the information sets. But maybe Inku's asking, what about other game trees? Is that?
Oh, I see. So that is so essentially our transparency order only applies kind of fixing a game tree. Now in the paper we extended to like a slightly larger class of mechanisms as well, but we don't really want to take a stance on whether you should choose one of two completely different game trees with different levels of transparency. That is not something that we're able to compare right now. It would be very interesting to think about how you should compare transparency across game trees, but that seems, that just conceptually that seems like a harder and less the answer seems less obvious than kind of this partial order that we came up with for now. Yeah. Okay. Great. So let me I'm gonna skip this this proof sketch, and I want to very briefly talk about the Learning Foundation. I'm just going to give you kind of the summary slide of what we do, and then if you're interested, I'm happy to talk at some point, or you can look at the paper. Okay, so in particular, I've shown you that once every agent is behaving according to this course rationality heuristic, that is kind of self-supporting. It's a meta-equilibrium. Nobody has an incentive to deviate. But a different question is, when can we expect this heuristic to kind of arise from some endogenous learning process? Okay, and so that's exactly what we try to do. And so what we show in our main result of this section is that in as-if dominant strategy mechanisms that satisfy a certain set of regularity conditions, course rationality is going to emerge endogenously from a learning process in which you have large generations of agents that experiment with best replies to the behavior that they observed in the previous generations and progressively learn to avoid iteratively dominated strategies. Okay, and so in that sense, course rationality over time in these large generations is going to become both positively compelling and normatively compelling. And so what I mean by that is that it's both going to describe the play that we observe everybody's going to choose coarsely optimal strategies, and choosing coarsely optimal strategies is going to suffice to behave optimally. Okay. So now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over this in detail, but really the way the learning process works is kind of just by defining a generation essentially via a restriction on the strategy set. So every generation just plays a particular subset of all the available strategies, and then they're gonna kind of sample among the best replies against last period, and eventually gonna discard the behaviors that consistently are outperformed by some other behavior. Okay, and so under this, what we can show is that in an as-if dominant strategy mechanism, course rationality is always going to emerge from this sort of generational learning. Okay, and so this gives you one potential reason for why this heuristic might arise in a population. Okay, and so the regularity conditions that we need for this are going to be satisfied for the Ausable auction as well as the sequential TTC and DAA algorithms. To accommodate the online English auction, we need a slightly stronger learning process that has like kind of one additional condition added to it. Okay, and then apart from giving a learning foundation, what this is also going to allow us to show is it's going to allow us to show that actually in all the mechanisms that I discussed earlier, we can provide sufficient conditions for that they satisfy that ensure weak dominance solvability. Okay, and so again, I'm not going to go over this in the interest of time, but in as-if dominant strategy mechanisms that satisfy our regularity conditions, we can actually conclude that those mechanisms are weak dominance solvable. And so what this means is that you can, if you didn't like that I kind of was mixing rationality and equilibrium, you can kind of drop the equilibrium condition that I imposed in the definition and replace it with weak dominance solvability, and it's not going to make a difference for most of the application settings. Okay, and so this is going to be true again for the Ausable auction, the sequential DAA, TTC, and a slightly weaker version of this result is also going to be true for the online English auction as well. Okay, so let me put up the conclusion so that we have some time for questions at the end. So what I hope to convince you of is that dominant strategy mechanisms severely restrict the transparency that we can use on a given game tree in order to achieve our goals. And so this can make it very difficult for agents who struggle, for example, with contingent reasoning to identify dominated behaviors and to use heuristics such as course rationality. Okay, and so as-if dominant strategy mechanisms essentially try to propose a solution to the tension between transparency and dominant strategy incentive compatibility by providing greater transparency while maintaining course rationality as a meta-equilibrium of this class of mechanisms. And then we saw some applications of this both to this online auction setting as well as to multi-unit auction and matching settings. And I briefly talked about why this heuristic might arise from a learning process and how we can use it to provide sufficient conditions for weak dominance solvability as well. Okay, thank you so much. And thank you so much for all your questions. This is very helpful.
Okay, thank you, Lea. I'm just going to go in alphabetical order with Andrew and Linchen, unless you disagree. Andrew, do you have any questions, comments, things you want to say? Please.
Yeah, sure. I got plenty. One that just jumps out to me is kind of a reaction to thinking through your online example is you get an interesting disclosure policy. It's not disclose nothing. It's not disclose everything. It's something in between. That's what I mean by interesting. And my intuition is that must be very closely related to bossiness, in the sense that if, as I understand course optimality, I should have a best response to any belief I might have whose support is the course strategies. Then as you provide more information, this set of beliefs remains the same. I just gain access to new strategies. And so why could one of these new strategies, I acquire a new dominant strategy that's problematic? My intuition is, well, I can get the same payoff for myself, but influence someone else. So specifically in the online auction, well, I know I'm going to exit, but I'm supposed to push the price up to my value, and I can choose whether or not to push it further or less far. I mean, this is even kind of a channel for collusion in the auction. So have you thought about, and I have a similar intuition when it comes to your regularity conditions. Have you thought about non-bossiness specifically as it relates to these?
Yes, so we haven't formalized it yet, but we share your intuition, which is that essentially the reason for which more transparency at some point might be problematic has to be related to the rule being bossy in some sense, because indeed it's just creating kind of more indifferences for you, and these indifferences are not going to be shared by the other agents. And so there's actually a condition that is very much related to this, that appears in this paper by Marx, which proposes a version of this learning process, but for settings without private information, which is exactly this idea that if I'm indifferent between things, you better also be indifferent how I resolve my indifference. And so that is kind of the version of the condition that we think is needed in order to think about the bound of transparency here. Yeah.
So all the example you present has a feature that the underlying game is a dominant solvable or sequentially dominant solvable. And do you have any example that is not dominant solvable? Do you have a for example? I think this idea can be, you can apply this idea to, let's say, game with risk dominance. Think about risk dominance with a very small p-value, which is very close to dominant solvable, but not quite. And the heuristics is basically kind of muddy the water of your reasoning process. That's exactly the idea of this p potential, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, so right now we restrict to mechanisms that are, well, to strategy-proof implementable choice rules. Now this, when you say dominant solvable, so we know that for example, even mechanisms that are strict dominant solvable are not necessarily as if dominant. So for example, kind of the beauty contest is not going to be an as if dominant strategy mechanism, and it is weak dominance and strict dominance solvable. And so the connection is perhaps less clear than it might appear from kind of the couple of things that I was able to talk about in this last section. Now, more generally, if you're thinking about mechanisms that are not dominant strategy, that only have, for example, a Bayes-Nash equilibrium, we think are a very interesting kind of next step to think about. However, there is kind of the missing part there is to understand what the complexity of the beliefs is as well. Because we want to kind of make it simpler for agents to behave optimally. And information in general is going to require you to kind of update your beliefs, which is a very hard task. We know that that's difficult for people to do. And so it is kind of less clear to me that people are going to make less mistakes in settings where information is going to require them to update their beliefs, because we know that people do this in kind of biased ways. And so in general, I think that in settings where I need to take account of people's beliefs, the conclusion might not be as straightforward, and the kinds of information that we want to reveal might look very different.
Linchen, did you have any comments?
Yeah, I also have a question. Lea, can you go back to the slides where you have the online auction example?
Yes.
So
sorry. This one?
Yeah, perfect. So now suppose you have another person, like say David, who bids for one, so just for a price of one. So according to your transparency definition, you still want to disclose this information that David bids for one, right?
Absolutely.
But in some sense, like for Carl, when she thinks about this problem, so this piece of information is like unnecessary for her. And it's in some sense it might increase her mental cost when thinking of the problem. So she first needs to take out of this unnecessary information, and then kind of like based on just like on Alex and Bob.
Yes. No, I think this is a very good point, which is that there is something, when we're formalizing the cost of transparency, one cost that we're not thinking about is the cost of you processing the information that I provide you with, right? So I've just kind of assumed that that's costless for you to do. And so that means that in my model, you definitely want to disclose even if a third, fourth, fifth, sixth person submitted a bid, even if these are kind of not relevant towards the final outcome anymore. Now, I think the answer to this should be kind of how you design the information disclosure. And so eBay does this in a very clever way, right? So they do exactly kind of what you suggest, which is eBay tells you what they call the current price. This is the current second highest submitted bid, which indeed is the current price if we ended the auction right now, right? And then they give you a button you can click on in order to see literally the entire history of bids, including kind of the identity of the bidder, the time at which they submitted it, how high it was, even for the bids that now are kind of irrelevant for determining the outcome. And so I think kind of the way to resolve this tension between you want this information to be there because you want people to believe that they're actually being placed in the contingency that we're placing them in, and but this might take them a lot of mental cost to process, would be through kind of how you present the information and through framing, which I think is a super interesting question that would also be nice to formalize in future work for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay. Does anybody else want to ask questions? We have a couple of minutes before we stop the recording. So quick questions.
Can I just follow up on the dominant solvability? It's a little provocative to me because dominant solvability, where we get to some refinement of beliefs is through, you could think, common knowledge of rationality and sophistication and rounds of thinking in the beauty contest. Yep. And here it's almost like you start from an assumption on beliefs. I don't think anybody's going to condition on more than their experience. I don't think they're going to pay attention. And it's a completely different flavor that they're overlapping for this class of games is
I think it's interesting. So it was known for this result was known for the Ausable. So it was known that the exposed incentive compatible Ausable auction is weak dominant solvable. To the best of our knowledge, it wasn't known for the other mechanisms that are as of dominant and dominant solvable, weak dominant solvable. I agree with you that it's kind of interesting. And the way I like to think about it is that essentially what these mechanisms do is they do kind of a twofold thing. For people that have high costs of thinking about larger strategy sets, or people that are literally cognitively limited and don't see these very contingent behaviors, there is kind of a straightforward best response. And it just so happens that that corresponds to the best response. Well, that corresponds to the strategy chosen by an agent who is able to engage in iterated elimination of weakly dominated strategies. And so perhaps in these mechanisms, weak dominant solvability is like kind of almost more reasonable because even some people who are not able to do it are given a reason to choose exactly those strategies that is much more simple than weak dominant solvability itself. So, it's kind of a mix of a population with like very sophisticated and less sophisticated agents. You can think of, these mechanisms kind of giving both of them the same set of strategies to choose. Yeah.
Okay. I think we could stop the recording here. And thank Lea, Andrew, and Linchen for participating.